So as with all things, on a big screen and under the lights, things don't look, you can never anticipate what is going to happen. So there are a couple graphics that you might not be able to see, but I'll ask you to imagine them in terms of. So again, my background is in anthropology, and the way that I came to working within libraries and in research data services is through the Council on Library and Information Resources postdoctoral fellowship that Elaine mentioned. My interest in becoming involved in this type of work, though, came out of my research. So for my dissertation fieldwork, I did a mixed method study, a qualitative study, an ethnographic study with an LGBTQ community center in Arizona. And we were following an amendment, an anti-gay or a one man, one woman marriage proposition, basically, in the state of Arizona. So I was following research participants from their work as volunteers within a community center into their work as volunteers within a campaign, and looking at volunteerism and professionalization within the LGBTQ larger organizational community, I guess you'd say. As part of that work, I ended up working with a transgender health and social service focused organization that was a part of it. I had just become part of the center, and I conducted a health and social service needs assessment as part of that work. Both of these projects, they were related. The social service needs assessment was much more applied. But they both brought up really interesting issues around data sharing, ownership of data, and how best to provide access to data or materials collected during the research process to research participants and communities. And the ethics that go along with that, and whose voice gets heard, who has a say, and how that fits within those expectations and the research ethics boards or IRBs in the US, and expectations of, say, your dissertation committee and the library in terms of what should be published and in terms of open access to dissertations and what might be contained within that. Within an environment where increasingly people are telling their own stories online, what they tell you in the privacy of a one-on-one interview where you promise anonymity, they may rework and tell on social media. And there are lots of interesting ways that it's very hard to maintain anonymity for research participants today. So, long story, but that's how I came to be interested in data curation, how I came to be interested in the ethics and surrounding that, and also in health research. And because I really saw some parallels between what was happening in terms of the relationship between clinical researchers and their patients, and what was happening as a social scientist, as an anthropologist, and the responsibilities that I had with the participants or collaborators. So this is what brought me, and this is part of my approach to thinking about research data services, and that informs the way that I do my work, which I'll talk about today as data work, and it informs the relationships that I build with faculty, students, and other researchers, and my colleagues also within the library. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about, Elaine had asked me to think about research data services and what is the status of research data services. So you have to imagine some bubbles coming out of the research data service in the middle. So this is a loose outline of what I'd like to talk about. So I want to talk about data work in relationship to research data services or labor, right? Thinking about collaboration, infrastructure, and how we plan for the future, how we plan for the unexpected, and whose voice is heard, and who has a role in making these decisions. So this is, the background that you may not see very well is actually a chalkboard. So this is how I came to present information. I was a teacher, I was an instructor at a university for around 10 years, teaching undergraduate sociology, social science methods, anthropology, gender studies work in the classroom. And I went through a phase where we moved from the chalkboard into PowerPoint and the expectation around that. And I mention this because it tells you something about changes within the environment around expectations of openness. So in the last couple of years I taught, so 2012, 2013, before I took the postdoc at University of Alberta, I realized that a lot of my students were asking me after class, can you please share PowerPoint slide? And putting comments on my evaluations. PowerPoint slides are not detailed enough. They don't get into all, so they really wanted a complete work for every session. They wanted all my sources. They maybe didn't want to take notes. I'm not sure about that. It was a very different orientation, right? So that's a movement in this sense. So this expectation of openness, of wanting what we would consider the pre-work. So maybe I want to write up an article about this presentation or a classroom instruction. But people that are involved are wanting access before it becomes polished or finished. And so this was a struggle for me as a instructor, and it's still a struggle for me as a researcher. And it's something that informs, again, my work with folks, trying to get them interested in open science, open access to maybe even pre-publication sharing and data, which oftentimes people see as messy, as something they don't want to share in many instances, and it gives you insight into the background of knowledge production that many people may not feel comfortable with. So I wanted to start out, this is my only table. I don't know if you can read it or not. So this is basically, what I did in preparing for this presentation was to take a look at the literature on research data services, focusing first on surveys and scans, both of universities within the United States and Canada. And this came out in part from how I connected with Elaine, I believe was through the DLF e-Research Network, formerly the Peer Research Network, where it's in its third year, so if you're still interested, I think there may be still some openings, I'm not sure. So for 2 years I was involved as, first as a postdoc for the program, and then as faculty. And we basically worked with a small group of institutions who were interested in developing research data services. And one of the first things people wanted to know was, what are other institutions doing? Is what's on the web page really what is happening? What's being left out? And so I think one of the reasons that they were interested in being involved, or at least we got some feedback, is that they actually wanted to talk to people about how did this work within your organizational environment? How do you deal with assessment and these types of things? So we did a lot of this surveying the surveys, scanning the environmental scans. And so this is informed by that work as well. And I have to mention that I'm not the e-Research Network faculty this year, but there are some really exciting, Bethany Navowski, I believe Trevor Munoz and some other folks are involved as thinking about how the development of humanities data services within the academic library. So I'm just going to go over a couple things I thought were interesting about the current literature, and then tell you a little bit more about my experience with working within the Canadian and US context. So in my maybe difficult to read chart here, on the left-hand side, these are just some areas that seem from both the work with the e-Research Network and then the scan of the scans. There seems to be an emphasis on this idea of policy formation, education and outreach activities that fall within this area, data analysis and training, tools and infrastructure, and collaboration, both informal and external, as well as regional. And collaboration in terms of developing and allowing for research data services, but also in terms of research collaboration. And so I will talk a little bit about some trends in terms of shifts in the way that library faculty and staff are becoming involved in research. Right? So across the top, we've got what's been scanned. So as I mentioned, one of the first things, maybe many of you have done this, you might have gone out and looked at the web pages for academic institutions, their library web pages. Who's doing what in terms of research data services? So Ina Cooper and her colleagues have done a pretty extensive search of ARL websites. They presented a paper, a presentation at iAssist last year, and they have a forthcoming chapter that's going to deal with maturity models in research data services. And so for the web, pretty much they did see that some of these features aligned. So on the web, people are talking about data policies. They are talking about consultation and instruction, also included around the data management plan and development. That would be the major emphasis on the web presence. There is also an emphasis on processing and analysis of data, and deposit of data, repositories, and storage, as well as that sometimes aligns with or in a different section of a web page, the storage, archiving, and preservation. Along with collaborations, we see a lot of emphasis on, in the US, the DMP tool, and within Canada, using the model of the DMP builder from the UK, and leveraging these across multiple universities across the country. When we go to surveys of administrators or library leaders, there is a focus in looking at Tino Pierre's work in 2012 and 2015. There is an emphasis upon research data services strategic planning, information consultation, under education outreach, technical services, developing technical services, deaccessioning data, and also increasingly research data services and research collaboration. And I would say that's also the emphasis at the Purdue University libraries, where we've been asked to think about the connection between service and collaboration, preferring to move towards that idea or the model of collaboration. But it is difficult to talk about a service model to some degree within that setting. And then if we look at Gold and Cox and Penfield, thinking about how our librarian roles have changed, and what's important. So policy and advocacy, support and training for librarians within the institution and researchers, and also going back to some of the roots within the library of data services, looking at social science services, GIS, bioinformatics, and increasingly visualization. Tools and infrastructure that, this question of should librarians be involved in the auditing and accessioning of, and deaccessioning of data within the repository environment, and what role or tension does that lead into within archival practice? And of course, emphasis on research collaboration. And finally, what do researchers think they want? So recently, just this week, Ithaca S&R came out with their faculty survey response. And one of the areas I found interesting in the initial report was that 2/3 of the faculty interviewed across ACRL, so that includes 2-year, 4-year, and university, research-intensive universities, that 2/3 of those surveyed are not involved nor plan to be involved in research data services. And this aligns in an interesting way with what Ithaca found from their response from the faculty, which is that 2/3 prefer to preserve and organize their own data, and less than 10% rely on the libraries and publishers. So I think again, I won't go over these again, but this idea that there is a alignment to some degree, or at least in maybe the way that we frame the kind of work that we're doing within and outside of libraries and collaboration, so that there's this emphasis on policy, education, and outreach, to some degree data analysis and training, tool and infrastructure building, and collaboration. So I'd like to focus on this idea of, and I'll provide citations, but I'm sure many of you have already read this work, and maybe have work that you could share of your own that would get much more detailed into the development of these service and service models. What I would like to talk about in my remaining time is do we want data service or data collaboration? And this is something to think about when building research data services and models. So some of the tension around data service, the data service model, comes about when it emphasizes and privileges the central role of certain types of traditional research in researchers and academia. So when I was at the University of Alberta, one of the key things that I focused on, my first presentation to the library about my work with health researchers, I did a diagram where researchers were in the middle, and then you had this sort of looking at networks that develop around them, the types of services and needs and how we might reach those, and the infrastructure that exists. So what happens when you decenter the researcher within this process and think about other actors, other stakeholders? When you also think about the library, when you think about data workers, when you think about the public, when you're shifting. So we think about data service, it may tend to emphasize this also relationship between the data worker or the librarian, the research data specialist, and research. When you talk about data collaboration and think about its implications, the work that focuses on data collaboration tends to emphasize, it can emphasize and privilege central role of certain types of traditional research, as well as potentially emergent forms in digital methodologies and perhaps the workers and services infrastructure that need to support that. You may also get a trend where in data collaborations you're thinking about librarians as researchers as well within academia. And I think to some degree that's the model at Purdue, where when as a new faculty trying to get a handle on tenure and promotion, how do you put the type of work that I'm engaged in as within the tenure and promotion documents? So does it fit under learning? Does it fit under research? Does it fit under service or engagement? Or all three? And how do you make yourself fit within that framework? And another possibility, data workers contributing something of different but equal value in terms of curation, digital platforms, database creation, program development, instruction, etc. So what happens when you shift from thinking about data service to looking about data collaboration? Even if you still call it a data service model, what happens when you shift and you're thinking about this? So I've been looking for other models. This is something that in my own job, I am doing more and more outreach into the College of Liberal Arts. We're interested in working with social science and humanities. Now, social science, you might think that's a perfect fit. We have there's a history within libraries and data archives of work with social scientists, especially around managing, wrangling, getting access to large social surveys, governmental data, other forms of open data, right, that aren't coming necessarily from the primary researcher perspective, or these larger scale studies. Within the new model of research data services and data curation, some of the language has shifted and changed over time. So some of those relationships that were maybe initially forged by earlier data librarians that may still be working within different departments, maybe they moved around a lot, at your university if you have one, or in a social science data lab that may be on your campus, or an archive. The new approach within research data service is focused on data curation and sharing is a little bit different. It may require new language, new ways of dealing with folks, and new people coming in, and librarians who are being retrained or moving into this area may also not have the disciplinary knowledge and background to to connect with folks. So there is a lot of relationship building that still needs to happen with social scientists and the humanities around the development of data services that actually not only meet needs that may be defined, but that provide collaboration, especially for those who are less well-funded, within the system. So what are the other models of collaboration? So we could go back, we could look at some in Canada. I was asked to, as starting out, let's see, I don't think this is, what was that? Okay, so thank you. So one of my mentors at the University of Alberta was Chuck Humphrey, and he sort of gave me daily a history lesson on on initiatives in Canada and the role of data librarians in Canada and in the U.S. So one of the things he connected me with was the Data Liberation Initiative in Canada, which it comes out of, is still operating. It's a way of accessing census, social survey data originally from the government. So the kinds of networks that were developed actually in the Canadian context have provided some of the framework for for regional and ongoing discussions around research data. So in the CanLib, listserv, iAssist Canada, Research Data Canada. Accolades still happens, which is a list, a meeting for data librarians, more statistical data. But data librarians have been very active within that context and hold more prominent roles, perhaps than within the U.S. Although there's definitely connections. So we have the models from social science data archives. So this, I think, is very important when thinking about infrastructure and sharing across regions or federally. We have the models from social science data archives. I've been trying to connect with folks who are still with active archives to understand the kind of relationship building that they have and learn from those earlier collections. From my background in anthropology, I was much more familiar with museum collections. We can look at natural history models of collecting, if we want to look for history of data collection, both learn from lessons from around funding, especially today, or pitfalls of potential funding impact. We can look at increasingly, archives and special collections. And in my own work, I am involved in some collaborations with archivists and those in special collections. The history of researcher or society databases and data collections that have a long history, and of course, increasingly digital scholarship or humanities centers. Which, if you look at, I was talking to Rick Mulligan from ARL as well. In his work, he's also looking at. He mentioned that data management and research data services, that these are things that are being integrated into some of these centers as well. So in terms of digital infrastructure, this is one of the things that's happening in Canada is what is infrastructure? And I think increasingly as we work with more humanists involved both in digital scholarship and digital humanities and data curation, we'll be increasingly asked to answer this question. So what is, to us, what is digital infrastructure, and how does that infrastructure impact research? So in order to, as opposed to some movements within research data services, for instance, the recent conferences that called for making the infrastructure invisible, many researchers, not just in humanities, but across, are very aware that the infrastructure does actually influence the research design, questions you can ask, that infrastructure isn't neutral, just like data is never raw, right? So these kinds of questions are things that I think libraries have to increasingly deal with in a way that maybe archives and special collections have had to deal with in a different way. So I think there's a lot of learning that can happen across those professional divides. Also paying attention within that to the political and economic context of the development of research data services. So who is asking, and there are definitely some folks who are asking this, but who is asking why development of research data services? Why the libraries? Why do funders are they requiring this? Because I know that researchers that I'm dealing with are asking those questions. So thinking about just some keywords, what role does science and education policy? If we look, can we historicize the development of research data services? What impact did the fall of the Berlin Wall have on the development of research data services? Shifts of priorities and funding to the valuing of data as a commodity, as something that has value beyond the research context, even if many of us would like to locate that research data within that context. The rise of open access as a movement that in many ways has left the confines of its origins, so that you hear, corporate, academic, others using the language of open access, but may not, that there's been a transformation of the meanings of these terms. So asking more about, in the planning for research data service, about the political and economic context. And not only does that help to understand why we are doing what we're doing, but also thinking about planning for the future. So not getting involved in what some have called a hype cycle, in planning thoughtfully for the development of research data services, infrastructure, and tools. So what kind of future do you envision for research data services? And I think that that's really the focus of the workshops today. Thinking about, but I would also like to challenge you in all of your workshops and your planning for the development of research data services to think about how can you include more people, professions, and interest into the development of those services. How might you decenter maybe those that are most powerful within the university setting, who draw the most funds, for instance, whose voices have been heard. So how do we think about context and scale? What are the political and economic factors that influence the development of services and the continuation of collaboration? How do we address these issues of privacy and data ethics that have always been part of the discussion around the development of the open access to or restricted access to data, research data? Thinking about data as a commodity, and that even if data can, in some contexts, not be copyrighted, it does move, it has value in an economic sense. And thinking about data work and digital labor, and that happens not only for those who are maybe involved in service side of things or tool and structural development, but also on the researcher side of things, right? So researchers are also producers of data. They also reintegrate data. They do curation. How do we think about and to actually have real conversations about the value of this kind of digital data work and digital scholarship? And for those of us who are in tenure track positions, how might we use the tenure and promotion process and work with our libraries to really value those forms of digital scholarship and data creation work in and of itself, not as something that you write about for a scholarly publication, but as a product in and of itself that has value. And then finally, how might we evaluate power relations in infrastructure and data assemblages? And that these are discussions that I hope to increasingly see happening at any conference that deals with research data services development and libraries. So I hope that you have a wonderful day, and I would love to talk to more of you. As I said, please feel free to reach out to me, and I would love to have more discussions about who defines the problem and the needs, and who decides on that solution. So, thank you.
Does he want to take some questions?
Oh yeah, okay, sure. So I guess I have time I didn't go over too far. I have some time for questions if people want to follow up with me.
And we do have a mic for people.
Okay.
The roving mic here. Hold on.
Okay.
Good morning.
Hi.
My question.
Would you announce who you are?
Sure. I'm Sarah McCord from Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences in Boston. Okay. And you mentioned, I believe it was the Ithaca SNR 2016 report, where 2/3 of faculty manage their own data and 10% of them work with libraries and publishers, which left me wondering what the other 23% do. Do you remember off the top of your head? Or?
I don't, but I do have the connection. So I'm combining a couple of things there. So they asked, and I have the link if you'd like. We can share that to the report that just came out. But I believe there were two areas. So it's people. They asked a question to researchers. They focused more on like throughout the life cycle, and then they focused after the. At the end, sort of at the point where you might be sharing or preparing your research at the end of a research project, and at that they actually asked about the publishers as well. So there's a variety, but I don't have all of the data with me. But yeah,
the link is more than sufficient.
And I think that I think something interesting to note about that is that I believe that it's more the ARL. Yes. So with Tinopierre, it was the ACRL. So you had the 2-year, the 4-year, and the university. And I believe, I'm not positive, but I think with Ithaca it was more the research universities. But I'd have to check on that. So I think you have to look at that. Maybe a lot of even for the 4-year universities. We may not be in those universities that they're getting over the 10 million in research funds. So that was something I think in both studies there's an interesting to look at what type of university and what the focus is. So, yeah. I think that, yeah.
Hi, my name is Ron Tam, I'm faculty member at Simmons College. My question is regarding your comment about the model, data services versus data collaboration. The fact is whether someone can be in a second model, which is data collaboration model, is pretty much determined by the culture of the institution and also the disciplinary research practice. In the past, we have been talking about librarian faculty collaboration. And the focus, we talked about librarians being embedded as an embedded librarian, like working with, in a medical setting, working with doctors, doing rounds and so forth. But from other disciplines, the focus have been, in terms of collaboration, the focus have been, collaborating in teaching, information literacy. How can a librarian embed in teaching a session in a class, teach about searching certain databases? Librarian, I don't know whether it's a fact, but my perception is librarians have not been frequently embedded as a valid member, legitimate member of a research team. It may not be true in the medical situation, maybe that's more frequent model, but my observation is the reason that librarians are not frequently embedded as a member of the research team is maybe there's some kind of misconception of librarians' skill set and librarians' knowledge about research. I mean, this is also the fault of allies education. We have a curriculum structure where we don't necessarily encourage librarians, to take research method class. At Simmons, research method, we call it Evaluation of Information Services, is not a required course. And I doubt, we have actually several students here from Siemens. I doubt they actually take that class if they don't have that interest. So then you have librarians have this reputation where they hate math, they don't know how to do statistics, and then you have the curriculum that doesn't encourage people or sort of force them to take research data related courses. And then so you have this inadequacy or this thing for librarians to not necessarily being able to be a research team member to do a lot of data handling and statistical analysis. So I think there are a lot of things that LIS education needs to do, and there's also a lot of things that we librarians can do to change the culture so that we can really...
Well, okay, I just wanted to respond real quick, is that, are we out of time?
No, go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to respond that I think part of what I was talking about, and and I was referencing Siddiqui, the data assemblages paper that just came out. I have a link there. Is that would be part of that model where you're looking at research, like librarians or library staff or faculty as researchers. And I think there's also, I think that that's valid, and I know many librarians who are researchers, both in health contexts with systematic reviews and also who increasingly are social scientists, to some degree, or they're data modelers, or they're doing things that are, they have maybe even statistical background. But I'm also talking about another thing, which is like value of what librarians in the past and currently are doing around research data and digital projects. So value for what you're doing in and of itself. And I think it could be potentially a good model, and if we have an open enough environment in our libraries and support, especially around tenure and promotion, is to model that along with folks involved in the digital humanities and others, of alternate ways of valuing something that it does not have to fit into that research box. Because researchers, including faculty and students, are also interested in doing things that aren't just traditionally bracketed with the research. They're interested in public engagement, building digital projects. It's scholarship, but it may not fit within a brander mode as in the past.
I'm just a quick comment, actually. Research Harvard was saying Sarah Ashton's library. I just want to say Ron was being hard on herself. She's actually doing really great things at Simmons Library School. That's probably why she's here, but
yeah.
Just a quick.
Okay.
I just wanted to refer you to this afternoon's one of the breakout sessions called The Informationist of Leah Honor. And it's an example of librarians being embedded into the research team. The National Library of Medicine has funded several informationist projects throughout the country over the last couple of years. And in this funding, researchers can add supplemental funds to their existing research grant to pay for librarians' time to be part of the team. And we've had two of these projects, one with Sally Gorson, who you know, who worked on a project that looked at why women don't follow with mammography. And in that project, she created a data dictionary, and they are creating publications out of that work. And then Leia's project you'll hear about this afternoon, where they're looking at trying to develop a standard that would be used for an association on how to identify neurological images of children with autism, MRIs. And so those are really two good examples of where librarians are part of that team and doing the work of research.
Well,
and we'll be publishing that work.
And Elaine, I don't know, Emily Augustinus is in the back of the room. She's like, why didn't you mention this? I'm involved in 3 or 4 projects right now. They're research and digital projects where we're working like with the Clear Hidden Collections grant with Center for History and Medicine, University of Alberta. And we're looking at health data, maternal child health data. And it is a research project, but it's not, it wasn't considered research by the University of Alberta. It was operational or something came in, but we're trying to work across archives, special collections, and with librarians, metadata librarians, around this. Also, I'm working with a digital preservationist there on new models for computer-assisted qualitative data analysis. We're looking at data in the archive for enuvialuate photographs. So I mean, there's a lot of projects. So when we put that exhibit up, or we put up a scalar page that highlights the work, I'd also like that to be counted towards, for instance, my promotion and tenure. We'll see if that happens, or if I need to. I mean, I will write, but so there are. I think there's lots of great projects that probably some of you are involved in collaboration. Yeah. So.
The reality is 10% or less people want to, use other. This percentage, the things that you describe, I think is true, but with, looking at all the LIS graduates that we have, what percentage are you? So my concern is, how do we actually make this as a normal part of librarian practice, instead of actually just have few outstanding people doing the research work?
Well, I think, maybe this is shocking to you because I'm from a research background, but I think maybe it's not always about, even in research institutions, it's not always centering the researcher as the collaborator. We collaborate across institutions. Librarians, we do our own work and have our own publics that are also important. So I know for fun it is important to connect and to mentor undergrads, graduates, and graduate students and researchers. But I know that there are these constraints. One thing I'm just asking is for people to maybe consider when you're developing these services what that means to have researchers at the center. In that service model. And so that's just one thing I'd like to leave you with. Okay, thank you.